Have you ever wanted to get inside the inner workings of high-profile criminal cases? True Crime and Human Design explores thrilling stories that reevaluate themes through an energetic lens. What new details and pockets of understanding might we see when we apply a human design filter to some of life's darkest corners? I'm your host, Corinna Rujo, and this is True Crime and Human Design. Hello, lovelies. We are going to start this series with the one, the only Jeffrey Dahmer. I think it's really important that we emphasize the significance of his crime. I also do want to acknowledge that anything I say, any information I put out there, is never an excuse for his behaviors. An excuse is completely excusing the behavior. It's not taking accountability for the behavior. The way I look at a reason is it's providing greater awareness, greater insight into why something could have or would have or has happened. I think it's also really important that we emphasize that this is not to glorify him, and we really need to address these situations, address these topics so there aren't further victims. And the victims are extensive. It's not only the people that he did actually murder, it's their families, their loved ones. It's the fear that was placed and experienced due to his actions at a larger level. And I just think it's really important to start with that. Jeffrey Dahmer's case is definitely the case where I have the most insight on, the most natural wisdom on, because he is the perfect example of what happens when a system fails. So, with that being said, there's a lot of information that is probably going to be coming your way. I really want to encourage you to make sure you're in a space where you can really process this, where you're available for this, and never feel like you have to be listening. It's going to be here. You can come back to it. And yeah, it's really important that you take care of yourself during this because I do try and bring a trauma-informed language to the forefront. However, sometimes there are just words that are going to be really heavy, are going to hold a lot of weight, and could be really triggering. So with that being said, we're going to dive into his human design chart. I also access the gene keys, and with it, I really hope that I can help connect the dots, not only into understanding his human design, but how it correlates with him, how these energetic themes repeated, why there were certain areas that were so prominent, how he really got to this point, but also really highlight how his lived experiences have contributed to creating this monster. Because that's what happens. There is this dialogue out there that is based around evil, and evil is born, evil is created. We have to understand that evil is created. There are so many people, so many kiddos that I have looked into the eyes of, and according to their paperwork, according to case studies, if you wanted to define evil, you could probably define it there. And people do jump to those conclusions. What I've seen is trauma. What I'm seeing is generational trauma. What I'm seeing is systemic failure, systemic barriers. And what I'm also seeing is a lack of opportunity, a lack of hope that's created by these systems of power. So when I say I specialize in complex trauma, I understand that cycles of abuse not only perpetuate in relationships, they perpetuate at a systemic level under these systems of power. It's all about power and control. Now let's dive in. The basics. Jeffrey Dahmer is a 1-3 emotional manifesting generator. For any of my human design junkies out there that want to know a little bit more, his definition is a single definition, and his incarnation cross is the right angle cross of the sleeping phoenix. We'll get into all of that. Jeffrey Dahmer, 1-3 emotional manifesting generator. Now let's tap right in to the nuances. I want to dive into his incarnation cross, which when we look at that through the gene keys, it's going to be his life's work, his evolution, his radiance, and ultimately his purpose. And his purpose is more this quality of consciousness that he brings. And specifically, the life's work is the conscious sun. So you'll see that on the right-hand side of his chart, and it's in gene key or gate 20, 20.1. And then underneath it, you have his conscious earth, which is 34.1. These are significant because as we evolve into this new paradigm, the sleeping phoenix is really discussed more in depth with human design, should I say expert, who have really been following the patterns and seeing the evolution. So it plays a major role in this shift of the new paradigm, which I just thought right off the bat was interesting. But I want to break it down even more. So the 20th gene key, which again, gene key is gate. Gene key dives in deeper, but that's what the gates are in human design. So the 20th is known as the sacred Om. The shadow is superficiality. The gift is self-assurance, and the city, which is the highest essence, is presence. In human design, this is in the throat centers, which means that it's looking to express itself. So ultimately, everything is searching for a way out. All the energy is looking to express itself in your body in some way, shape, or form. And it does through that throat. So as a manifesting generator, he has a defined throat. More specifically, he actually has the 3420, which is the only pure manifesting generator channel connected from his sacral, that defined sacral, to that motorized throat. And we'll go into that more. But the dilemma of his conscious sun is self-awareness. The victim pattern is a victim of insecurity. At the shadow level of being, this is all about being superficial or absent, about being viewed or viewing inwardly and not being aware of oneself, others, or your life. When we see gene key 20 and 34, we really want to look into the house that they're in. So I pulled up the house he's in. Awareness is a very prominent theme in 20, and especially with moving out of the shadow state, it's cultivating that awareness to really bring forth those gifts. And always the goal is to get into that highest essence. So with pulling up his natal chart, 20.1 is in the 8th house in Gemini. So I'm going to sum up this stuff, and then I'm just going to dive into understandings about Dahmer more. So really put this all together for you guys to understand, but I want to make sure I don't miss anything. The 8th house is really based around sex, taboos, death, and death is really in all forms. It's around resurrection. It's around other people's possessions. It's really thinking about the mysteries of life, haunted by an awareness of the fragility of life, and potentially drawn into career fields that can include death. With sex being prominent, sexuality is also prominent. And with that being said, the shadow is being superficial, and the way this theme is going to really show up is in that 8th house. So it's going to be based around sex, it's going to be based around taboos, resurrection, other people's possessions, death in all forms, sexuality. It's diving into those deeper conversations. However, when you look at superficiality, what does superficiality mean without me going into it right off the bat? What do you consciously think of or unconsciously think of when I say superficiality? When we're afraid of how others see us, we put on this mask and we don't allow ourselves to go deeper. I actually have quite a few eighth house placements. And my motto is like, why can't we have fun talking about complex topics? Which, like, hello, I'm right here talking about complex topics. It makes a ton of sense. It's about diving deeper into these really complex areas that hold a lot of weight and do deal with significant themes that provoke emotional responses. And that's natural. That's okay to provoke emotional responses. So, superficiality, ultimately, you are avoiding yourself. You're avoiding going into these depths. And that avoidance really comes because you don't trust yourself. If you're being superficial, you care about what others think about you. And this was a prominent theme for Dahmer. He didn't feel like he fit in school, he didn't feel like he fit in at home. He actually, in school, they called it doing the Dahmer, and he would run down the hall and mimic a person with developmental disability. And he really did that because he lacked self awareness, he lacked confidence, he lacked his identity. And it was then that he would get attention. It didn't really matter what the attention was, he was getting attention, and on top of it, people were laughing. His perception was that it was less bullying and he was making people laugh. So he would put on this persona and do the Dahmer. It was reported that he was pretty shy, which again really makes sense with that superficiality because you're really insecure. You're not self aware. When we say that the dilemma is self awareness, it's a dilemma because he's insecure and he ultimately has to cultivate that self awareness. And when you have to cultivate that self awareness, that means that you have to face things that you might be avoiding, which leaves you at a superficial level. Specifically for Dahmer, with that 20 being his conscious son and it being his life's work, plus in the eighth house, it's really looking into these complex topics. It's understanding that he does want to explore these in a confident manner and that he does have that gift, that ability. Naturally, those energetic themes exist for him. Ultimately, needs to face whatever insecurities he has, whatever traumas he has, in order to be comfortable, be confident talking about these topics. Here I am putting myself out there and talking about some of the most heinous crimes and doing it with a spiritual tool, a system that really I gained in the spiritual world. And I'm also combining trauma into it, which there's a lot of lack around trauma. If I wasn't confident in myself, if I wasn't confident in my passions, I would silence myself. I would dream about doing this. I still have all these thoughts. So with Dahmer, that life's work is really diving into those depths. It's really diving into those taboos, into death. And when we say sex specifically, there's this theme around sexuality. Here is his desire to be intimate with others, to form connection with others. But he did not have the skill sets to form appropriate and pro social relationships. And pro social are those healthy relationships. And a lot of that goes back to one, the times, the systems of power, the structures that were in place. He was a gay man. The first time Dahmer ever kissed a boy was at the age of 13 years old. Mind you, he was born in the 1960s, so this was early 1970s. At that point, being gay was not accepted. So, really hiding his sexuality, we see that come up, which can feed into not being confident in himself, having to put on a facade, being superficial, living up to other people's perceptions of him. And when you do that, you get lost. And it's really hard to ground yourself and to say, okay, I'm lost. It's really hard to have that capacity because part of having that capacity is feeling supported. And Dahmer did not feel supported. His home life was extremely disruptive. There was very chaotic dynamics between his parents, and there was a ton of fights. Dahmer felt very rejected from his mother, and I get into that. I'll go further into that, but So, yeah, here, right off the bat, he comes out of the womb, and his life's work is to transmute this shadow of superficiality into the city of presence. And he does so through self assurance. And self assurance really views oneself in relationship to the world around them. Here, a certain level of awareness begins to cultivate. He would have been able to move past the opinions, the perceptions of others, and cultivate a self awareness, a sense of self trust, and belief in oneself. So that being said, he did not have that self-trust in himself. He couldn't be who he wanted to be, and he didn't understand this sexuality either, because he actually, when he was 13, he also was dissecting an animal in science class. And he reported feeling the same lust or excitement over dissecting the animal that he did with kissing the boy. Now, before we all jump to conclusions, I really want to slow down with this because a lot of us did have to dissect animals. I know for myself, I had to dissect a pig. And science does run in Dahmer's family's history. It's not weird that he would be passionate. Actually, if you look at his chart, which we'll go further into, he was quite passionate and he was meant to be really hands on diving into these depths and dealing with death. However, when he's not gaining developmental awareness of these thoughts, these desires, he's having to place himself in a box and tell himself he's wrong and fight off the desires, fight off these gifts, fight off the constant thoughts. He's repressing that or attempting to repress it in order to allow himself to be perceived as something. And what happens when we stuff shit under a rug for too long? Look at the world. That's exactly what's happening right now. When we stuff shit under the rug for too long, it explodes. That's what happens with trauma. That's how we see external behaviors, is that we're imprinted internally. And the more we repress, the worse the behavior is going to be. Because at some point, your threshold is going to give out. You can't take anything more. I thought it was very interesting, too, that sexuality is a strong learning lesson. Sex becomes really an all or nothing thing, and a person can be highly sexual, asexual, or restrictive of sex. Society told Dahmer he was wrong. He was living in that time period of you can't be gay, and that supported this further complexity, these insecurities, and inability to be himself. And we see that in the crimes he committed. Ultimately, he never wanted anyone to leave him. This was very attachment based, very insecure. It was insecure attachment before I even saw his chart, but victim of insecurity is his conscious son. It's his life's work. Hello, it's right there and it radiates off him. He had that insecure attachment style and he didn't want people to leave him, and he couldn't be okay with his sexuality in its full self because systems of power weren't okay with it. So going into that 34.1, Gene Key 34, the shadow is force, the gift is strength, and the city, the highest essence, is majesty. I found a quote that said, power is only great when its display or use comes from an inner balance. Being that the 34 was his evolution, it was his conscious earth. It's really what's here to ground him, what he's here to learn. It supports that gene key 20. They're programming partners. So it's needed to support that, which means in the shadow state, they do exist together as well. So with the shadow of 34 being force and the shadow of 20 being superficiality, here he is forcing himself to be something that he is not, forcing himself to meet this persona, to be this image, to not be himself, to not dive into these topics in a healthy way. in a way that benefits the collective. And also on the other end, forcing something to happen. And we see that with his brutal crimes. It's a very primal energy. And specifically, he has it in the second house. So it's Sagittarius in the second house, which really is based around values and self confidence and trying new things over stability. Working a boring job just wasn't going to do it for him. And the values derived from knowledge and being able to explore. We see this theme of him needing to explore what lights him up, what he's fucking excited to do, needing to cultivate this knowledge around things that he loves. And in that sun placement, he likes diving into the depths. Literally, if you just quickly Google it, the 8th house is drawn into career fields that can include death, going deeper into the 34. This is a really independent and self-centering circuit. It's the integration circuit. So it's not concerned about doing something for the sake of others. What actually happens is when someone within the integration circuit does for themselves, does something that they love, something that's empowering, in turn, it empowers and inspires others. Specifically with the 3420, it's like succumbing to life, it's succumbing to trust, which builds so much trust and really does empower others to say, I don't necessarily know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do it and look at the results. With this 3420, there's this desire to take instant action partnered with the ability to respond to the truth in the present moment. There's a huge focus on sustainability. If I'm stepping forward, I'm not stepping back because that's what creates sustainable progress. This is really looked at as one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful channels in the body graph, because it is a pure manifesting generator channel, which means that it has that motorized throat directly connected to the sacral and ultimately has instant access to manifest life force energy. So with the shadow being in force, forcing things to get done, to manifest, forcing your energy to make your vision reality is not sustainable. And ultimately, we see that for many different reasons, but with it specifically laid out right here too, we do see it. He was forcing himself with these crimes because this is a shadow state. This is a primal state. This is a lower level of awareness, which means he's in a survival state, more or less. He is not living up to his gift. He's not stepping into his power, and it's creating harm. And so that forcing things to happen, if you look at his living conditions, he ultimately got busted because he was forcing. He got sloppy. I thought it was also really interesting. The 34 likes to collect things. And ultimately, this theme of collecting things really feeds into proof that something was done, proof that he did the thing. It's like those trophies and walls of proof. Specifically, guys, I can't make this shit up. And if you look at his crimes, you'll see the collection that he had been creating. He could have been caught. At one point, there were bodies in the shower. There were body parts sprinkled around the apartment. There were bodies and pictures of corpses in his bedroom. Here's that collecting because it's showing that he did it. It's also feeding that attachment of they're not leaving him. So next we're going to get into his core wound. Dahmer's core wound is gene key 60 and it's in a 4 line. This is known as the gate of limitation. The shadow is limitation, the gift is realism, and the city is justice. It's really this closed circuit thinking. It feels very limiting. There's this longing for change.
With closed circuit thinking specifically, it stops evolution from happening. Look at the way we think. Now imagine them as electrical wire. Now imagine you just stop the wire and you don't allow anything else to come in between. There's no energy, there's no charge going anywhere else. It's just back and forth in that constricted little area. Very limiting. This looks at being a victim of structures, and the dilemma is balance. The representation of the shadow is in the realm of human laws. We create laws that govern our society, and in turn, we put systems in place to implement these laws. One of the greatest areas you can see the true power of Gate 60 is in religion. It also exists in schools, suppressing youth through structures. And again, it's really existing in that human mind. So right away, just going into that and saying, okay, what does this mean? So ultimately, a situation happened and he's existing in this limitation, in this closed circuit thinking. What the closed circuit thinking does is ultimately he just becomes a victim of structures. And we see that in itself. Dahmer actually was failed at a systemic level, which made his victims of the structures in place that failed to intervene for him. It was also very limiting. So he needed to create this balance, and he was unable to do that because we also have to remember his identity. So he had to hide himself because of the structures in place. And again, there's that closed circuit thinking. When we see the 60, when we come into deeper awareness of being closed circuit, of feeling limited, of being unable to create balance, of becoming a victim of structure, we see just this perpetuating trap. With this, he has a self-perpetuating nightmare of control and reaction. The archetype is the cuckoo bird. So when he's in the shadow state, deeming him cuckoo, this may feel like it's preventing originality. It feels very victim, like life is not fair. He doesn't have common sense. He's constantly feeling victimized, like he can't or doesn't know what to do because he doesn't have the structures in place to facilitate change. So when we look at structures, we're also going to look at what systems did he have in place around him? What relationships did he have in place around him? He did not have the structures, which is the support to facilitate change. That dynamic within his family was very hostile. So for him, when he is experiencing all of this, his response is to feel this victim of structures, this victim of lack of support, feeling like he doesn't know what to do and getting really stuck. I'm picturing him as a little boy, like really stuck there, and his brain has no idea what he's supposed to do with the situation. So he's unable to break out of these existing systems. The systems that were in play were these structures that didn't support or help to facilitate change. He becomes stuck. With that on top of it, he's really unable to be himself. For this specific gate, we look at 3 types of limitations. There's human laws, limits from our past, and the human mind. And within human laws, all structures will eventually decline. Look at the burning of Rome. Look at all the structures and systems in place that no longer exist. They're all going to eventually decline, which, relating that to him, his actions, his structure, his own system he's created at this point will eventually decline. That's a prime example of his fate. It's this over attachment to the systems, to the supports that really kills the spirit. So he was seeking some sort of support, and in turn, he was stuck with what he had, and he created this system from what he had. And again, it comes from this need to control something. Outdated systems that evolution has outgrown. He is an example of this. Both his IC, it's at 20, 34, 55, 59. These are like new paradigm leaders. And this was back in the 60s. He really is here to bring this new system of awareness, this higher level of consciousness, this new way of functioning into the world, and also an outdated system that evolution has outgrown, his sexual identity, attracted to men. So this is where like religion comes in and moral laws. It makes humans question or doubt or follow, and this creates reactionaries. And ultimately what it did and what it does is it restricts the human spirit and it suppresses our truth. If I look at the 1-3, his profile, so this is really like an archetype. And I would look at that as being like, he deserves to be in a lab in a library. The 1 is this personality theme. So he is the bold creator. Recently, Eden Carpenter came out with this bold creator explanation, and I love it. Really picture like the Sherlock Holmes. They're the investigators. They're the ones that need to create the foundation. So right away, with that 1 line, he's needing security to create foundations. He did not feel a sense of security whatsoever. And that lack of security limited him in being able to create structures and foundations that were safe and secure. Now combine that with the 60, crazy. Right away, just with that 1 line, understanding that they're really here to do very bold things, because no one creates a foundation without doing something bold. Look at the excavators. My dad's been obsessed with excavating lately, so this is probably tapping into that. But look at the excavators. They're literally moving earth. How bold is that? So they're the ones that are really getting to the bottom of everything. They're typically the go-to person on their topic of interest because of the foundation that they've cultivated. There's a lot of self-study, exploration, introspection, and exploring the depths of the unknown, which is really tapping into this researching, learning, and reflecting. So with the 3 line, it's called originally in human design, the martyr. I call it the zesty game changer. Knowing it's safe to fail with the 3 line is so important. Those with the 3, they gain their knowledge and wisdom through trial and error because they discover what works. And in turn, they also discover what doesn't work. And that's what they can bring to the collective through their experience. They're saying like, hey, this worked for me and that did not work. And I'm just putting it out there. When you combine the zesty game changer, which is the way that he needed to learn, he quite literally needed to get his hands on things. He needed to be doing the research and cultivating the foundation and teaching from that 1 line. So teaching through that researcher. What matters are the other factors going into play, are the other dynamics, are the other attachments, the home life. You look at like the intersex of his identity here. And at the same time that he was dissecting an animal, he also, boy, he was going through puberty and realizing what he loved. And at that point, again, being gay is not accepted. So here he is, kissing a boy like, oh shit, and having to deal with that internal and external dilemma. This goes against the structures, which again, his core wound being 60, it's going against these structures, the systems. What does he do? What do? I don't know what to do. Where is he able to talk that out? Where is he able to understand that? One of these shows, it was like constantly mentioned, like, why don't you go find a nice girl? Like, how often do we hear that? How often is that said? How often was that said back then? We're becoming a little more inclusive now, but being a gay woman, it's heard all the time. When are you going to have kids? Who's your husband? Are you married? I hope he treats you well. And again, this is a different time. So here he is, 13 years old. And wow, I had these feelings when I kissed a boy. Oh my gosh, I also had these feelings when I was dissecting a pig, which if we look at his history, science runs in his family. So I'm not surprised that he's interested in science, that he's interested in anatomy. That's very real. We have people that work in the morgue. Do we shame them? It started somewhere, right? And someone has to have these passions. People have always asked me, like, how do you do your job? How do you come home and sleep at night? I am able to. That's my passion. That's my purpose. Doing this, diving deeper into these themes, these cases, these topics. This is my passion. And Dahmer also had a very predominant passion and purpose. He was really here to be who he is, to show up as himself, have this passion, have this purpose, and be connected to this purpose, and be able to speak about it. And having that 1-3, being a bold creator and a zesty game changer, I really do see that if he was able to get the support he needed, if we were able to intervene at that point and say, hey, this is your passion. Okay, so how can we put it into fun outlets? Because I bet if I was 13 years old and I walked around being like, I love talking about trauma, I love talking about sexual abuse, I love talking about death, I love talking about homicides, I love talking about all of these really deep topics, I do know for a fact that people are going to be like, what's going on with it? So no, some of us are really here to talk about the really complex things and bring it to light, and he very much was. He was here to get his hands dirty. That was how he learned, was through getting his hands dirty in order to create that foundation. So here's this huge dynamic, again, where the system, his core wound, the limitation, the religion and moral laws, told him his sexual identity would send him to. So here he is, knowing that, repressing that, feeling that, thinking, I'm going to go to hell. I'm an evil, awful person for liking and loving who I love. And then, to top it off, he's also finding his passion. He's finding something he enjoys. But the way we supported him and using his love and passion in a successful manner was not facilitated, obviously, because look at where he ended up. So the other area of the 3 types of limitations is the human mind. Here's that closed circuit thinking. When he killed his second victim, he surrendered to God's fate for him. And that's what he thought in that moment. There was 9 years between when he killed his first and when he killed his second victim. He killed his first victim after his parents left, and he was a senior in high school and left in his home all by himself. So when we understand attachment theory, he really was completely abandoned. And you look at that 4 line, that fear of abandonment, that fear of rejection, that's so prominent. That's the theme that's going to show through for him, is that he's feeling rejected, he's feeling abandoned, and that's actually what was done. So there was this already dysregulated attachment, and he was seeking ways to connect with people. We see that in his 59-6, that channel, as is. He had this desire for intimate connection and conflict resolution. What he needed was physical safety. His physical needs need to be met, and he needed to be safe to be himself fully with the people around him. He requires emotional safety a little bit more than maybe you do. And that's okay. We all have our needs. We're all unique. We're all diverse. We don't fit a cookie cutter. And that's part of the issue, is we expect people to fit a cookie cutter. And then we're like, oh my God, why are they acting that way? Because they're breaking out. Because their behaviors and who they are has been so repressed that all of a sudden it's pushing its way out. So backtracking, you look at his attachment style. He obviously had insecure attachment. He just wanted someone to love him. He didn't want to be abandoned. And his mom took his brother right away. It's okay, I'm not good enough to be taken. I'm just good enough to be left. And quite literally, that's what was done. That's what was represented and modeled to and for him, that he was that disposable. And then his dad also left. So he's a senior in high school, and he's just wanting someone to see him. He's been known at this point as being a little odd, being isolated, being a loner. It's that lab in the library. This is where you're going to see people that are getting really hands-on, just diving into the nitty-gritty of it. So he was doing all of those things. He just wasn't being provided the support he needed in order to not turn out the way he did. So again, a lot of systemic failures there. When he killed his first victim, he was a senior in high school and his family had just left. He was looking for someone and he wasn't allowed to be gay. So here's all these gay feelings coming up and he lashed. The repressive side of his core wound is there's minimal structures. He wasn't given the space to come to terms and understand his sexual identity. He wasn't understood. He was isolated. He was picked on. He was looked at as a weirdo. Instead of being like, okay, wow, he has this passion. What do we do with it? How do we guide him? Isn't that what guidance counselors quite literally are for? Guidance counselors. So systemic failure on the school's part, systemic failure all around. The reactive nature is very rigid. It's controlling of what others do and say. This is him lashing out in anger. Anything new is a threat to his security. With the line 1, he needs his security. He needs a sense of safety. With this core wound, the way it's going to show up is either in a repressive nature, feeling constricted, not being able to do anything, not being able to use his gifts, or it's going to be reactive. It's going to be rigid, where he feels the need to control. We do know to the extent of what he was fantasizing about, which can we also touch upon the fantasies. Fantasies are actually normal. That's why there are people who practice submissive. The language specifically, I might get it wrong right now. But like dominatrix, right? Some people want to be dominated. Some people want to be the submissive. At that age, especially with a lack of inclusivity, with a lack of support, with a lack of awareness around his thoughts, without being guided and validated and actually shown what his thoughts meant, someone interpreting his thoughts for him and helping him understand them, because that's what development is all about, is really allowing someone to bloom, to blossom, to step into these different spaces and gain new skills. A parent's role is really to support and provide those resources, so those skills can develop, so that you can interpret it and you can understand it and you can be successful. And this just really wasn't done at all. So with those, he wanted to dominate. Yeah. You look at attachment theory in itself, and it's like he just wanted someone to be there. He didn't want someone to leave, because all he knew and all he feared was this fear of abandonment and fear of rejection. And that's what his attachments represented to him, was that he was easily disposable, that he could be gotten rid of. So he didn't have any support in showing how he could facilitate, how he could handle those situations and those scenarios when they came up. So with this first victim, he just wanted someone with him. He didn't know how to act when people left him. And for him, the reality is that was a trigger. Just knowing attachment theory. Someone tried to leave him. Look at what's happened. He's been abandoned. And his human design has that written all over it. So going into other aspects of his chart, we really look at the channel 59-6. So there's this desire for intimate connection and conflict resolution again. What needed to happen for him was this honesty through conversation, sharing how he actually feels. The 59 specifically is meant to be his higher level of awareness, like this higher code of consciousness, this consciousness like that he just sprinkles in as his purpose. And the dilemma is trauma. The shadow is dishonesty, which is ultimately not being able to be honest with yourself. And when we're not honest with ourselves, how does that perpetuate into the world? What behaviors do we take? Because he was unable to be honest with who he was. In turn, what did he do? The gift is intimacy. He transforms dishonesty into transparency through his gift of intimacy. He needed the intimacy. And when we understand intimacy, we're looking at it not from the primal level of physical connection. It's through the sharing of this awareness. But what we know is this primal connection. So there's a twofold here. The intimacy is looked at a physical awareness, a physical connection, and he couldn't actually live out his purpose. He couldn't be who he was with who he wanted to be physically. But knowing intimacy in its highest form is actually being able to share awareness, transforming this dishonesty and opening the space to just be who you are and allowing other people to tap into who they are as well. I do want to note that this is actually his authority channel. He's an emotional authority. So when he makes decisions, he's meant to ride his emotional wave and come to a neutral clarity, not in the high, not in the low, but ride that emotional wave. And it connects directly to the sacral center. So that's the 59-6. That holds even more prominence, this need to have this desire for intimate connection and conflict resolution. What that is saying, again, is that there was a deeper drive. So when I look at his attachment as is, it made sense of why he got to that point. And a lot of you might cringe when I say that, but that's the reality. And when I see his design, it makes that much more sense because that's what he needed. That's what he craved. And here it's what is the opportunity to get more honest? It's needing self-transparency. It's really tapping into preservation, keeping what you care about most closest to you. And we see that. This is where, to a trigger warning, when he did commit these acts of violence, he literally was preserving them. He needed them to be close to him. The 3410, this is another channel that he has. Again, this is his gift, and this is a prominent theme, and it's this instant desire to take action with your most pleasure. When we look at the 10, that's really that gate of self-love. And then it's combined with that power to take action of the 34, that power, that strength. So this is actually a self-empowering channel. I'm just going to repeat that. The instant desire to take action with your most pleasure in mind. So people might look at this as selfish, but actually if he used this into his highest state, if he was given the support, if we intervened like we should have, if we didn't create systems with morals that are based off of religion that are very outdated, and evolution has outgrown, then his actions actually would be self-empowering. But he still gains that self-empowerment. So when he was committing these acts, it was actually tapping into gifts of his, which is probably really hard to hear. But so much of it was, look at the 1-3 in itself, it's the lab in the library. He was tapping into these gifts of his own, and it was empowering him in the moment. And if he was given, again, all of the support he needed, it in turn would have inspired and empowered other people just from seeing him being himself, loving who he was, which he didn't have self-love. That 10 needs the self-love. It's about self-love. He didn't love himself. So of course it didn't empower people. You're quite literally responding to things. It's a channel of exploration and wants to express yourself at a soul level. That 10 needs to be attached to your soul. So he was actually expressing his soul and what he knew in the tools that he was given. The 3420, it's responding to these creative impulses by surrendering and letting it manifest through you. We really saw this second murder. So what happened in between? I tell this to people all the time. Look at how strong attachment is. Jeffrey Dahmer is such an example of attachment theory, and his human design is such an example of attachment theory in that, look at what attachment did for him. So he was kicked out of the army and he lived with his grandma. He loved his grandma. He had a deep attachment to his grandma. What did that attachment make him do? It made him actually not want to harm, not want to kill. However, it was just a Band-Aid. Everything was just a Band-Aid. He wasn't given the support. He wasn't given the resources. The structures in place weren't helping him. He was a victim of those structures. And instead, that attachment was so strong to his grandma, it took 9 years for a second victim. And that's the power of attachment. But ultimately, attachment can only go so far. If we don't have the skills, if we don't have the resources, if we don't have the support, and I know I keep saying the same thing, but it's so crucial. Developmentally, that's how we grow. If the next stages don't matter when our needs aren't being met in the moment. So developmentally, he was stunted. So it wasn't about reaching those developmental milestones. And when something happens to you, when you experience some sort of traumatic event, which his family and misattunement and his caregiving is a traumatic event. We look at complex trauma, traumatic events over time during childhood. And there are numerous ones. Just him being gay in itself, the reaction to society and having to suppress himself and not be who he is, that is traumatic. The idea of developmental milestones is that in the meantime, kids are getting all of their needs met. So then when a new developmental milestone comes, you're ready to step into that. You're ready to learn. But that only happens through safety and connection and through that developmental milestone previously being completed, and his was not completed. Each developmental milestone that came next, every time he aged, when he turned 13, when he turned 15, when he turned 18, he wasn't seeking what someone whose needs were being met at that prior developmental milestone. It wasn't about seeking the friendships. He was literally focused on surviving. It was all survival. So again, responding to creative impulses by surrendering and letting it manifest through you. We saw this in his second murder. Ultimately, he did respond. He took action. It's this urge, it's this impulse. He surrendered to the impulse, coherent or not. Then we look at, so going a little bit deeper, and then I'm probably going to wrap it up, is where you look at his spleen gate. So we see his spleen is undefined. So actually what he does is he takes in fear and what doesn't feel good and what's unhealthy and what's healthy, and he amplifies it. I have a completely open spleen, so I actually realize this is what happens when I walk into a haunted house. I instantly get flooded with everyone's fear, and it's so overwhelming. I freak out. But this is what's happening is he's taking all of that fear. He's taking all of these unhealthy and healthy dynamics. He can feel all of that energy tapping into all of that, and he's amplifying it. So specifically for him, he's amplifying gate 44 and 28. And what does this mean? So 44, the gene key, is all about relationship dynamics. How does fear operate in your family? He was taking in how fear operated in his family, and he was amplifying it. Some are submissive. They're just trying to keep the peace. Others react. They externalize the fear through anger, irritation, or trying to control everything. He was trying to control his victims. He was trying to control the outcome. He didn't want them to leave him. He had a fear of abandonment because of what happened, and because naturally his energy actually just has a little bit more fear of abandonment than, say, mine. That rejection is such a prominent theme for him. And not having that sense of safety and security and feeling like a failure is also extremely prominent. So again, how does fear operate in your family? And when someone has this, they can fluctuate between being submissive, trying to keep that peace, or reacting. And it's externalizing that fear, because a trauma response, again, is a visceral response. What we see are the external behaviors, but it's already been imprinted there. So we saw this reaction with him, and it's fear through anger, irritation, or trying to control everything. The programming partner is 24, so the shadow is addiction, and it's really about avoiding our suffering. He was an addict on many layers, and that addiction stemmed from trying to avoid his suffering. So this is an unconscious for him. He's learning through that influence. So these patterns are doomed to repeat themselves if he doesn't receive a new representation, if someone doesn't show him a different way. This combined with gene key 55, which gene key 55 is what keeps him healthy. He's meant to feel his emotions. He's meant to ride those emotions. Having gene key 55, what makes me healthy is really knowing that I'm meant to ride my emotions, and I'm showing the world in turn that through tapping into your emotions, yourself that space and permission, you actually create this sense of freedom. And gene key 55, what he needs in that unconscious earth, he needed freedom, or he becomes a victim. The gift is freedom, and the city is also freedom. Combining 44 with gene key 55, this suffering as a theme. We look at the spleen, and again, he's actually not here to hold on to fear, but he does have these little pulses of fear that kind of come through him. It's his way of dealing with unhealthy situations. The spleen is very primal. It's also a feel-good center. He has the 44 and the 28, and the 28 is this fear of letting go. The dilemma is avoidance, where it's not facing life out of fear and letting struggle and challenge allow you to feel defeated and like a failure. When I say he's in the shadow state, he's acting from a lower frequency, a lower resonance, a lower consciousness. Ultimately, there are so many little factors that contribute to what Dahmer did. And when we just look at attachment theory in itself, it was like a ticking time bomb. Then when we dive into his energy, what he needed a little bit more, and the way his energy would have shown up in the world, we can see that he actually was living very aligned with this lower level of awareness, this lower level of consciousness.
If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, share the love with your friends, with your neighbors, with your coworkers, with your community, and head on over to my social media, my website. I'll leave the links in my bio, and let's just share. This is really about connecting and sharing awareness, because that's what intimacy is at its highest level of consciousness. Thank you so much. We'll chat soon.